It is Monday, March 17th. Happy St. Patty's Day to everybody. It's my first St. Patty's Day here in the Northeast. And we're in a bit of a strange moment. No, I'm not talking about the legal permanent residents that have apparently been arrested and detained and some even deported. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is this H-2B cap, which hasn't been announced. It is now 14 days since we think the cap was hit on March 3rd, and yet there is no cap announcement. Now, one notable thing about the cap being announced by USCIS is that it triggers the release of the H-2B additional allotment of workers. But here we are, 14 days after the cap was probably reached on March 3rd, and there has been no cap announcement. So you might wonder, well, what's the big deal? Well, again, if you don't announce the cap, you don't trigger the release of the additional H-2B workers. Now, you have to announce the cap if you know it's been reached, or you have reasonable cause to believe, one would think, that it has been reached. And yet, 14 days on, and it hasn't been officially announced as being reached, which means that we don't have a date for the additional worker allotment. I'm not one for conspiracy theories. But folks, looking at everything else that's happening, I have to wonder if we are going to see, for the first time in this program's history, a nasty surprise that's going to cut short the H-2B season. I'm not saying that the H-2B additional workers are not going to release. I don't know. I don't have any information that leads me to believe that. But what I do know is that it's been 14 days since the cap was probably reached. My last receipt was from March 3rd. I thought it was March 4th in a prior video. It was March 3rd. And if the cap was reached on March 3rd, then we would have expected to hear by March 5th, 6th that it had been reached. The longest it took before this, if you're wondering, ever in history was 8 days, but we are at 14 days. So folks, if I'm you, and I've got returning workers that I need to bring in, I'm probably making a call to my congressional representative. I don't know what's happening. I'm not saying I have any insider knowledge. But 14 days without the cap being called, when USCIS clearly knows whether or not the cap has been reached. And again, you wouldn't call it if you didn't want to trigger the additional worker allotment. Folks, that has me worried. I'm worried for the employers. I'm worried for the nature of my work. I don't recall ever being this worried. So what I would tell you is, if you got H-2B returning workers, it's time to start calling some representatives to ask what's going on with this cap release. I know it's one of 1,000 things that's going on and might seem low on the priority list, but if we don't ask, we might end up with a very short H-2B season. Because again, if they don't announce that the cap has been reached, then they don't announce that those workers, which have already been allocated by Congress, and we've all seen the power of Congress lately, they don't get to be released. And folks, that's it. That's the ball game for the H-2B program for this year and maybe going forward in the future. 1 to 10, my worry right now is like at a solid 7 or 8, because I'm still hoping it comes through. I have no reason to believe it won't. But if I'm you and I'm looking for a returning worker, I'm calling my rep, because right now you can't put in a returning worker application because the cap hasn't been called. It's just been sitting there for 14 days, 2 weeks. Unprecedented. So that's what I'm thinking about. If anybody has any questions, now's your time to ask. What do we do if the cap's not called? That's a great question. I don't know. I've got some ideas, but I'm going to save them until I see what happens. All right, guys, that's it. That's a very disappointing update, but it's a mystery. It's a mystery of what could be going on.